Thank you for joining us today. I was saying, this is so John Jacobs was just on explaining the critical work of the commission, and so in real time we get to see that you all are very busy with a lot of your work there. So we really appreciate you all taking the time to be with us today. I'm going to dispense with some of my introductory remarks, but let me just say that I'm so pleased that both of you could join us today. I had the distinct honor and privilege of working with both of you during my time at the commission. John and I were just talking about the important roles that that councils play to commissioners, and you both served in those roles admirably. So Commissioner Crenshaw, you served for both former Commissioner Kara Stein and former Commissioner Rob Jackson. Commissioner Roisman, you served as commissioner for former Commissioner Dan Gallagher. People don't appreciate how closely the councils not only work with their own commissioners, but the councils in the other offices throughout the commission. And so, thank you for your great role in that. Now, in terms of your term as commissioners, now I mentioned that Commissioner Crenshaw is the most recent commissioner to join the commission. You've been there for about 3 months now. You were sworn into office on August 17th. Commissioner Roisman is 2 years into his 5-year term, and he was sworn in September 11th, 2018. We talked a little bit about your backgrounds. Not only do you have in common the fact that you're former counsels to commissioners, you also have in common with each other the fact that you both practice securities law at well-known law firms. Now, in addition to that, each of you has something in common that I noticed with some former commissioners from long ago. So Commissioner Crenshaw, let me start with you. Interestingly, you're currently serving as a captain in the U.S. Army Reserve, Judge Advocate General Corps. And I fondly recall a time a few years ago when you brought members of the JAG Corps to the SEC for meetings. And I specifically remember that when I entered the meeting room, about 15 to 20 men and women in Army uniforms immediately stood up and snapped to attention. And my comment was, well, I could get used to this. And ever since then, I wish that I could have the same effect whenever I entered a meeting room. Now, I believe you've checked the history, and it looks like you are the second sitting commissioner to serve in the reserve. So is that correct? And tell us a little bit about how your military experience has been helpful to you in your commissioner role.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, first, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to participate today and for leading this discussion. And second, as always, I do have to remind everyone that the views I express today are my own and do not represent the views of the commission, the staff, or my fellow commissioners. But turning back to your question, yes, I believe that is accurate. I can't be 100% sure, but I believe I am the second sitting commissioner to be in the active reserves. And serving in the Army Reserves and serving on the commission are two of the great honors of my life. Now, doing both of them at the same time, honestly, is a little bit challenging. The time for both to do both well is certainly something that is difficult to balance, but I wouldn't change a thing. My Army experience, perhaps more than any other, my council role was important, but my Army experience has helped me prepare for the role as commissioner. And I think particularly in the following ways. One of the most important aspects of the commissioner role, as you both know, is to provide leadership. And my time in the Army has exposed me to many different leadership styles and many different personalities. And watching and learning from so many leaders and being exposed to the Army's leadership training is something that's been extremely important for me in taking on this role. And it's not just the Army's leadership focus. It's also the Army's sort of team-oriented mantra that's been instilled in me for years now that guides my approach to this job as commissioner. And my goal every day is to work with my fellow commissioners and to the staff to fulfill the SEC's mission. As we say in the Army, sort of one team, one fight. And that's the way it's helped me approach this job. And lastly, I'll say working with soldiers has helped me understand some of the concerns of retail investors that we as commissioners are here to protect. Just like any other group of investors, those soldiers have different goals and different worries, and it's helpful for me to hear what their questions are, what their concerns are at all various stages of their careers, and what they're thinking about in terms of their investments. And that's important to me so I can help give them a fighting chance at the financial futures that they so deserve after serving in our armed services for so long. And these things inform my decisions every single day at the commission. So I think that's one of the reasons the military has been so important for me in taking on this new job.
Wow, that's great. And you're right. I mean, the commission has a long-standing history and commitment to investor education. And one of the areas that's a particular focus is service member outreach. And I was proud to be part of that. And the military, right, moved from a traditional pension plan to a thrift savings plan, which is more like a traditional 401k. And you have 18, 19-year-old soldiers and sailors and airmen out there, and men and women who maybe don't understand the basics. And so I think you're taking leadership in that role, and helping on the education is very important. So thank you for that. Commissioner Roisman, you also have something in common with a former commissioner from long ago. So you served on the Senate Banking Committee, first as Securities Counsel and then as Chief Counsel. And in that role, you're following in the footsteps of former Senate Banking Committee Chief Counsel Ferdinand Pecora, who famously investigated the causes of the 1929 stock market crash. And that led to the enactment of several pieces of financial regulatory reform legislation. And in fact, the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. And then President Roosevelt, FDR, appointed Ferdinand Pecora to be on the very first commission. Now, you yourself played a key role in drafting and negotiating several pieces of financial regulatory reform legislation that became law, including the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act of 2018. And then President Trump appointed you as a member of the commission. So please tell us, how was your Senate Banking Committee experience helpful to you in your role as commissioner?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I apologize for my technical difficulties. I'll repeat the same disclaimer Commissioner Crenshaw said. My views are my own and don't necessarily reflect that of my fellow commissioners or the commission. And first and foremost, it's just great to be here. And I certainly was fond of going to this conference before I was a commissioner. So I look forward. Looking back at who's already spoken, I'm sure it's been a very rich and engaging conversation. So thank you, Mike, for mentioning Ferdinand Pecora. It'll be the only time in my life anyone will ever use Ferdinand Pecora and my name in the same sentence. So I appreciate that. That's probably as close as I'll ever get. So look, I think no matter what, this is, as Commissioner Crenshaw said, it's an honor or a privilege to do what we do. I think every step of each of our careers has been really kind of instrumental in forming how we approach the job. I certainly think, private practice, working at a public company, working in exchange, working for a commissioner were all kind of integral learning moments. But I do really value the time I spent on the Senate Banking Committee for several reasons. First is, it was a great place to learn that people who have very, very strong policy views can still be nice to each other and friends, despite, what I'd say is very kind of big disagreements on policy issues. And to the point, that's what I think oftentimes is less visible to those on the outside. Many of your closest friends are people who have bosses who have just different viewpoints. You can separate that, and you can see that you can build consensus, even though sometimes it seems like there's chasms that can never be reached. The other thing that I think was really kind of important is when you have a job, when you're overseeing several regulators, not just the SEC, it gives you a good viewpoint of like how important the role of this agency is, but also how it's just a part of the overall economy. And one of the things that I found particularly useful about, going to meetings was people would come in and explain to you, for example, an issue that they're seeing based upon a different regulator's, for example, capital requirements. And what you'd see is that it would have sometimes, unintended consequences in our markets. You could see capital requirements limiting the ability of certain market participants that, interact in the capital markets from either providing liquidity, continuing to be in our markets, or even entering it. And it was important to me because it showed that you have to have a holistic view about how everything works together. But also just remembering, it is a small subset, an important subset of the entire economy, but you're not the end all be all of the entire financial regulatory system. So I'd say building consensus and seeing, how integrated and integral we are to the broader markets were two really fascinating and important parts of at least my experience.
Yeah, no, those are excellent ideas, right? So I think we can encapsulate those as, right, the old phrase, the old adage, it's nice to be important, but it's more important to be nice, right? And you're certainly
Yes.
You're certainly both important and nice. So so thank you for that. So let's move on to priorities, right? So at the commission, the chairman sets the overall agenda, but individual commissioners can focus on specific areas based on their interest, based on their expertise. And you both talked a little bit about them already, but I'd like to talk to you about where you hope to influence the direction of the commission in areas that you're particularly interested in. So Commissioner Roisman, let me stay with you. So since you first took office about 2 years ago, you've been spearheading efforts to reform various parts of the proxy process, such as the role and regulation of proxy advisory firms, proxy voting mechanics, proxy plumbing, and shareholder proposals. So first of all, thank you for taking on this pretty thankless task. It's one of the important parts of the commission's mission, but it's one of those areas that for years people say, well, we should improve the regulation in these areas, but there's always something more urgent that was on the commission's agenda. And so by you taking leadership in this area, like I say, it's a pretty thankless task, but for those of us who know that this is an important area, thank you very much. So a couple questions related to that. So what accomplishments in your area are you most proud of? And in terms of going forward, what other proxy issues do you think still need to be considered by the commission?
Well, thanks. And as you know, you don't take this job to be thanked. Most of this is pretty thankless, but you do it because it's the right thing to do. So there are several things that I really appreciate. I think the chairman focused on, let's do a retrospective review of the proxy process. And two things you've already mentioned, which I think are good, which were, we looked at proxy advisory businesses. Importantly, we looked at the fiduciary duties of investment advisors, whether related to proxy voting, and we clarified kind of important aspects of that. We did a lot in terms of 14A, in terms of recalibrating, I think, the thresholds to make sure that people have a long-term interest in the company, so that when you propose something, it's also taking into account the other shareholders who actually pay for it. So I think those were important steps. I think ultimately the biggest task that needs to be completed, the one that actually is the hardest and takes the most work, is the proxy plumbing. And we've been fortunate enough that we've had a round table, we've engaged with the outside, there have been recommendations made to us about how we can further improve it. And I think that's the next step. I have yet to meet a person who thinks that this current Byzantine system works well. It is not efficient. It's things as simple as you'd want to make sure that your vote gets counted are incredibly complicated. There's a lot of intermediaries, and obviously there's a lot of money to be made in this kind of non-transparent system. To me, I think our next step is we've gotten good recommendations. Some places lack consensus, but I think that's largely because people have business interests that probably make it difficult to build consensus. But I think it's important for us to honestly just provide a blueprint of how we think the system works, provide transparency, let people comment, and let's try to think about a better way to do this. If ultimately people say this is the best way to do it, then we at least tried, but I do think that there's areas for substantial improvement. So I think that's what is next in terms of proxy.
Well, that's great. And let me stay with you for one more quick question. Outside of the proxy process, what other areas do you find personally interesting? I've heard you passionately speak about a couple different areas recently. So for the benefit of our audience, what are some other areas that you want to focus on? So
look, I mean, for those, not that I doubt many of you have ever actually seen me or heard me before, but look, the area, if you take nothing else from this, is I know I'm not alone in this, but this is something I've been trying to say in every kind of public setting I have, is one of the most important things to me is what we can do to combat elder investor fraud. There is not a topic that I think, this is a topic that touches everybody, whether it's a family member, a loved one, someone who's instrumental in your life. Everyone knows someone who's been impacted by elder fraud. And one of the things that has been great about this job has been I've been able to interact with a lot of elder investors directly, speaking at various homes, various outside areas. working with other regulators, including the Elder Justice Coordinating Council, about ways we can help combat it and educate people to make sure that they're as well prepared to tell their loved ones as well as make investment decisions. And so look, this is an area that I think needs continued attention. The thing I always ask people is, please come to us with ideas. I'm really personally interested if you have ideas of how we can be more effective in combating it. And I think it's one that I think will constantly need attention and frankly, further input. Outside of that, I think helping small companies to continue to get access to capital as it relates to equity market structure for small public companies, I think we need to be kind of looking at ways that we can help facilitate, secondary market trading. Capital formation is inextricably tied to secondary market liquidity. And so we've put out, a thinly traded securities paper, hoping for ideas. There's ideas from batch auctions and others, but I realize that, I think micro market structure issues aren't the reason that these companies are, not flourishing. But I think if we can, make, I think better improvements to capital allocation, capital formation, and reduce costs, it certainly helps. And then the last part, which I know Commissioner Crenshaw is really passionate about, is fixed income. If we can kind of get any kind of pre-price transparency, I think could be fantastic. And, post-trade transparency is currently measured in minutes. So any work on that, as well as kind of further resiliency measures for the treasury markets, those are things that I think, are incumbent on us to continue to kind of work on.
Wow, again, just reinforcing the number of important issues that are front and center at the commission, and the wide swath of things that the commission does in all three broad areas of its mandate, and your willingness to take on leadership there. So Commissioner Crenshaw, let me come to you. So we've already established that you've already established yourself as a strong advocate for investor protection. You mentioned specifically the service member outreach. Commissioner Roisman just mentioned sort of things in elder abuse. He mentioned the fact that you're interested in things in the fixed income market, which is also a passion of mine. So let me ask you, what will investor protections continue to be the main focus of your term? What specifically other areas that you're interested in, and then outside of those issues, what else would you like to focus on?
Well, first, I just want to say that I agree with Commissioner Roisman that proxy plumbing should be a priority issue for the commission. I think there's real consensus, I'll say, at the commission, maybe the interest outside or maybe not as quite aligned, but I think everyone agrees that we need more transparency and accuracy in the current proxy system. So thank you for raising that, Commissioner Roisman. As for my focus, investor protection, and particularly when it comes to retail investors, will definitely continue to be something that I am constantly thinking about. But I don't think protecting investors is necessarily its own separate issue. I do think it's part of everything the commission does. And I think all aspects of our mission are intertwined. And so with that perspective, I think one area that I am particularly interested in focusing on is what Commissioner Roisman mentioned, is the fixed income space, and particularly the municipal bond markets. Retail investors have more exposure, perhaps than anyone else, to municipal bonds, both directly and indirectly through various funds. And I think we need to do a better job of ensuring that all investors have the information they need to make the best investment decisions they can. And it's especially an issue for retail investors because they often don't have access to the same type of information that non-retail investors have access to. And I think that's true across all products, but I do believe it's especially true in the muni markets where a lot of bonds are thinly traded and there's very little pre-trade transparency. And I know, as you mentioned, that's something you, Commissioner Pivovar, talked a lot about during your time on the commission. And I know it's something you've researched as well about how this lack of transparency can drive up transaction costs for retail customers. So another serious problem for muni investors is that the information, in addition to not necessarily having the transparency, is that it's often very old. Our Fixed Income Market Structure Advisory Committee, I always have to read that one, what we refer to as FIMSAC, actually looked at this and found that investors often receive financial information that is remarkably 500 days old. That's quite astonishing to me. So given all of this, a priority for me would be to see us really take a deep dive into how retail investors are engaging with munis and corporate bonds more generally. And I think this is an area of interest that all the commissioners may share. So I would look forward to working with them to tackle this issue moving forward.
Yeah, I think fixed income market structure issues are ones that there's truly a lot of bipartisan support for. I mean, adding transparency to the markets was one that we found a lot of bipartisan support on when I was both at the staff and at the commission level. And to echo something that Commissioner Roisman brought up is that in some cases there's some vested business interest in there that you sometimes have to fight against and stuff on these issues. But ultimately, one of the things that's very clear is by providing investors with transparency on the primary offerings or even on the secondary market, it's a win-win-win for everybody. And the muni one is particularly difficult because I don't know how much of our audience knows there's something called the Tower Amendment, which actually prohibits the commission from directly regulating the issuers of the municipality. So we have to do it through indirect means, through the underwriters and some marketing rules and stuff. But the commission's been very creative in that space, and I'm so glad that that's an issue and that you're passionate about. Let me move on to where the commission's likely to go, the general direction over the commission over the next few years. And I'd like to break it down into sort of short, medium, and long term. So earlier this week, SEC Chairman Jay Clayton announced that he'll be stepping down at the end of the year, and Joe Biden will become president from 2 months from now and on January 20th. And then he will have the ability to nominate someone to fill the SEC chairman slot. Well, he'll nominate someone to be a member of the commission, and likely that person will also be designated to be the chairman, following tradition. But let's start with the very short term, in the next 2 months, right? So Commissioner Roisman, let me come to you. Jay Clayton's still the chairman, and the commission's at full strength. All 5 seats are filled. As one of the commissioners in the majority, what can we expect out of you? Give us a sense of what we can expect over the next month. What can get done over the next month?
So it's the chairman is still the chairman, so it's his agenda. I think the nice thing that for everyone is that he's been incredibly transparent about what he hopes to accomplish. It's in the Reg Flex agenda. It's no longer, I'd say, something that is more aspirational. It's actually something that he tries to meet the marks of. So whatever is left on that agenda, I think, is what he's trying to accomplish. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say I'm very thankful for Chairman Clayton's service and time. I think he's done an incredible service to this country and to investors. And I think he left the commission in a better place, moving a lot of the rulemakings that, I think were important rulemakings. So I really can't really tell you more than I'd say, like, it's still his agenda, and I think he's still trying to accomplish it. So.
Yeah, and I think, he's someone who, is not going to just take the month off and not do anything. So we're all trying to figure out which of the things on the Reg Flex agenda are sort of going to be the next ones in the queue. So Commissioner Crenshaw, let me come to you, right? So you're in the minority for 2 months as a commissioner there, whatever. How do you see your role during this time over the next month?
Well, I also want to start by taking the opportunity to thank Chairman Clayton for his service to the commission. The last year has been unprecedented in terms of disruption faced by both the markets and the SEC itself. And I think Chairman Clayton has done an excellent job of leading the agency and the staff through this pandemic. And in addition, I've also really enjoyed my time thus far working with Commissioners Peirce, Roisman, and Lee. And I think as part of this, it is important, and I think you'll talk a little bit about this later, but I think it's really important to remember that most commission actions are bipartisan. And so in the next 2 months, I expect to serve largely the same role I have served since I started my term. For the most part, agreeing with my fellow commissioners on various actions that the commission is taking. And together thinking through how we can best fulfill the SEC's mission of maintaining the markets and encouraging capital formation while also protecting investors. So in a sense, I don't think my role will actually change all that much in the next 2 months.
Yeah, you're right. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that, despite the fact that the press and the public like to focus on disagreements among commissioners, and there are, and as Commissioner Roisman points out, right, they can be disagreements on policy things, but it doesn't mean we all can't get along. and still be friends on various things, and you know, to have it out in terms of what we think are the various policy things. But most of them are on a bipartisan basis, which is important. So particularly in the medium term, right? So let's play this out. So after Jay Clayton leaves at the end of this year, the commission will be down to 4 members, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. And at that time, President Trump will designate one of the 2 Republican commissioners as acting chair for about 3 weeks until January 20th. And then after inauguration, President Biden will designate one of the 2 Democratic commissioners as acting chairman. And in both of those cases, and that can last for a while. So John Jacobs and I were talking a little bit about the period in which I was acting chairman. We were down to 2 commissioners, and Jay Clayton had been nominated to be the new chairman of the SEC. And we were actually in that position for 3.5 months. It's hard to tell how it's going to play out. Could be longer, could be shorter. But you know, we decided that Commissioner Stein and I decided it was too important of a period to not do important things. And so let me ask you, during this period where you're down to 2 commissioners, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, anything that needs to get done needs an affirmative vote by the commission. And so therefore, by definition, is bipartisan. Mm-hmm. So my question for you, let me ask you, Commissioner Crenshaw, first. What do you think are the most fruitful areas for a 2-2 commission to focus on? Could be weeks, could be months, could be, we just don't know.
So I think there's lots of things we can focus on. Going back to our earlier discussion, I think we could find bipartisan agreement around fixed income market structure issues. Right now, our fixed income markets are regulated using a regime that, as you both know, has been imported from the equity markets. And this can cause problems. You know, fixed income securities are treated in a very different way. And for example, in that regard, we imported regulation ATS, or alternative trading system, from our equities markets into the fixed income markets without tailoring it to how fixed income securities are actually quoted and traded. And Commissioner Roisman, I know you talked about the same issue in the Treasury markets in a speech that you gave in September. And I think you pointed out, and I agree with you on this, that the ATS for Treasuries rule that we proposed in September was a good step, but that we need to adapt our approach because the Treasury market has its own characteristics. So I think it would really help the commission for us to take what I'll call a bottom to top look at the corporate and the muni markets. And I think starting at the bottom and working our way up is important here. And what I mean by that is we need to understand how these bonds are actually traded and how these things are happening on the ground, and understand that as we build a regulatory system around it. So I think it's important we take that sort of bottom to top approach. I also think we could build consensus in getting more data into the commission and make sure we're using data effectively. I think the commission makes better decisions for both investors and the markets when we're better informed. And I think it's something that all of us have talked about in various speeches and statements. I think one example Commissioner Roisman has talked about is how broker-dealers reporting Treasury transactions to FINRA has informed our understanding of Treasury markets and contributed significantly to our regulatory approach. So I'd like to see us working on collecting data on areas of the markets where we don't have as much visibility. And one area I've mentioned that I'm concerned about is we don't have enough information about private markets, and that's an area I would like us to work on.
Yeah, so a number of potential things. So you mentioned Treasury markets, and for the benefit of our audience who maybe don't know sort of the inside baseball of regulation in those markets, the Treasury market, bond market, unlike the corporate bond market and the municipal bond market, the SEC basically has sole jurisdiction over those markets. But the Treasury market, it's a weird regulatory framework where Treasury kind of has some oversight, the Federal Reserve kind of has some oversight, and the SEC kind of has some oversight. And there's been various fits and starts to try to overhaul the market structure in that market. We had a flash crash a few years ago. People were surprised that there were, algorithmic high frequency traders in there. The dealers weren't providing as much support. And I think you're absolutely right. That's a very fruitful area to sort of focus on, and that requires coordination. Back to some earlier points both of you were making about coordinating with some of the other the regulators in the U.S. So Commissioner Roisman, what do you think in terms of areas of sort of bipartisan support that we can move forward on during a 2-2 commission?
Look, I mean, thanks for that. And I'd say when I think back of what has happened when there's been 2-2 or 1-1, I think there's been a lot that's been done. I think back to Chairman Walter and the proposal of Reg SEI. I think about when you were acting chairman in 15C212, T+1. There was a lot that was actually accomplished, I think, even when the commission wasn't at full strength. And I'm hopeful that we can continue to kind of have that conversation. I think, there is a lot we can still do in terms of fixed income. I think it'll take time because, as Commissioner Crenshaw said, we have to do kind of a really thorough analysis bottom up, but there are things that we should be looking in, especially treasury markets. I think we talked about this before, but I think we should, talk about central clearing. I think we should talk about bolstering FINRA Trace. I think we should be talking about making sure that there's a rationalization of the rules for market participants. But, I also think, we had unprecedented volume, volatility, and frankly, data from what happened in February and March. The plumbing of both our equity and fixed income markets, we have a better understanding. I think, especially in the equities, they performed incredibly well, but there is a lot for us to digest and see what we can actually improve to strengthen the resiliency of those markets. And I think that's an area we should focus. There's also, I think, a good lesson learned, because I don't know when this remote environment is going to change. And we certainly had a lot of temporary relief we granted during kind of COVID-19 that I think is worthy to kind of look back, because there's certain parts of our rules that are hardwired that contemplate paper and wet signatures and things like that, that I don't necessarily think, really are adaptable to the future state. So I think if we can kind of take some of those lessons and see if we can kind of update our rule set and ensure that they're able to be flexible enough for the continuation of this remote setting, I think that would be particularly helpful. But the thing I actually, and you touched upon this earlier, and Commissioner Crenshaw was she was excellent in this kind of portrayal. It's something I do want to kind of focus on just ultimately briefly, which is I don't view myself as a Republican commissioner or a commissioner of the majority. I view myself as an SEC commissioner. And there is a large portion of, I think, the people who talk about us who want to make it more interesting and pit us as, one side versus the other. That's not how I see it. We all have the same mission. We all view it through the same lens. Ultimately, we can have differences of opinion on policy, but it doesn't change, what we actually are. In starting, January, I will still be an SEC commissioner. I've been one since 2018. That's not going to change. I'm sure there's going to be disagreements on policy that I'll have with Commissioner Crenshaw, and I'm sure there'll be things we'll agree upon. That's not going to change, but we'll always be incredibly, cordial, respectful, and I think that's something that if anyone in the audience has questions about, that's the way we've always treated it. That's the way we work.
Yeah, thank you. And you both made the excellent point about how the commission, in trying to resolve some of these policy differences is really data-driven and analysis-driven, right? And in the important role of looking at empirical data and the important role of taking into account situations that we have, right? So, after September 11th, 2001, after Superstorm Sandy, after flash crashes, after, the volatility in February, the commission always does a great job at trying to look at the available data and say, look, are there any changes that need to get made, made to that, right? You think back to the stock market crash and the institution of the circuit breakers in the stock market, and the fact that they tripped, 3 times in March or 4 times or whatever it was, the commission's going to look at that. They're not going to get rid of those, but always trying to learn from sort of the last one and thinking about business continuity plans and some of the new things that are going on. And so look forward to some of the bipartisan stuff in that area. And I just mentioned the Center for Financial Markets and Policy. We did a webinar early last year, right after the volatility in the equity markets. And Commissioner Roisman, you're exactly right. The equity markets performed very well. There were calls to close the markets or to ban short selling. Those things always happen when the markets go haywire. And kudos to all of you for resisting those political calls to do that, because it was important to keep the markets open for liquidity reasons, for people who needed to trade, for price discovery reasons, for policymakers to make better decisions in terms of the stimulus and some of the other things that were going on, and also for people to manage their risk and things. So thank you for that. Sometimes you don't get enough credit for the things you don't do that are good. So keeping the markets open and the fact that the markets did work well, although you're looking at the data and maybe there's some improvements to be made there. So let's move on to the long term, right? So after a new chairman is confirmed and sworn into office, we'll be back to a full commission, and there will be a majority again in the minority. And you're right, the vast majority of things that the commission does is on a bipartisan basis, but there are some things in which, you know, there are some policy differences, and those in the majority tend to be on the winning side of 3-2 votes, and those in the minority are on the losing side of those 3-2 votes. So Commissioner Crenshaw, let me come to you first. So I don't want to get into names here, but can you give me a sense of the type of person that Joe Biden is likely to nominate as chairman or chairwoman of the SEC, and the type of issues that you expect the new chair to focus on? And you know, you'll be moving from the minority to the majority. How do you see your role changing?
So I think at first it's difficult to predict the type of person that President Biden will nominate. I do think it will depend on the particular issues that President-elect Biden will nominate. I think it will depend on the issues that he wants to see the commission focus on in the next several years. That being said, I wouldn't be surprised to see the next chairman or chairwoman, if they were to take a hard look at the commission's approach to ESG, or environmental, social, and governance issues, especially those focused on climate risk. But I will say, whoever it is, I look forward to doing whatever I can to help them transition into that role and get their feet under them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, certainly, you know, ESG issues have been, you know, my role at the Milken Institute has certainly been an issue that a number of our stakeholders are very interested in a number of different ways. And it's also been a focus of the conference this week. And so it's been an issue that's been front and center in a number of our sessions that are there. Yep. Commissioner Roisman, let me ask you about so you're going to be moving from a commissioner in the majority to being a commissioner in the minority. It will be a not unfamiliar role for you, where you were a counsel to a commissioner who was in the majority. It's not fun sometimes losing on those 3-2 votes, but you can still have an important role as a minority commissioner. How do you see your role changing?
So look, I'm not naive to the reality, but I would hope that it wouldn't change, honestly, that much at all. I mean, look, I know since the beginning of November, I've gotten less handsome and less funny, certainly balder and less smart. And I'm sure my dance card will get less popular. But I honestly will continue to advocate for the same things I've always advocated for. And my hope is to win the policy debate. And if I can, I can. If I can't, I won't. And I'll explain why. But it'll always be respectful, and it'll always be based on, you know, through the lens of the 3-part mission of the SEC. So I think, you know, there's things that we're going to continue to talk about. You know, I have very strong personal views on matters in ESG, and I gave a speech about this in July where I talked about it. And, you know, I think at least for those who are unfamiliar, I try to separate my personal views from my role as a commissioner. I wear a different hat, and so I always look at, you know, my job through, you know, what is our role as the SEC in this realm. But it's a conversation that I think is going to be ongoing. It's one that I can't imagine we're not going to be having in the near future and for the foreseeable future. So I look forward to hearing from people and continuing that dialogue.
Oh, that's fantastic. And we're just out of time. Let me just reiterate the fact both of you have mentioned a couple times about you know, hearing from the public on stuff, and they're not just saying that, they actually mean it. They want to hear various voices, whether it's formally through the public rulemaking process. Anybody can go on and comment on any rulemaking that's proposed out there, whether it's through informal meetings or those types of things. That's where as a commissioner, you get to learn from all the different aspects of what's going on that go into the rulemaking process. So with that, I would just want to thank you both. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules today and to share with us your insights. Thank you for your public service. Such an important time for, as we talked about, for markets, market participants, and investors. And hopefully the audience can see, as evident from today's conversation, right? You can rest assured that we're in very capable and dedicated hands in terms of leadership at the SEC. So I want to thank you both. I wish you both continued success in all your efforts.